There is a car that has been called a Nazi machine and a symbol of peace. A car that was designed by one of history's most complicated geniuses and then saved by a British soldier who almost scrapped it for parts. A car that became the centerpiece of a counterculture revolution, appeared in Hollywood films, and outsold every automobile ever built up to its time. A car so simple a teenager could fix it in a field, so ugly it was once described as a motorized tortoise, and yet so universally beloved that grown men wept when the last one rolled off the assembly line. It was called the Volkswagen Beetle, the people's car, the bug, and its story is not a straightforward one. It is a story of war and redemption, of propaganda and poetry, of an engine in the wrong place, and a shape that somehow became timeless. It is the story of how a car born from the darkest chapter of the 20th century became one of the most cheerful and enduring symbols of human freedom. This is the story the textbooks only partially tell. Imagine it is 1933. Germany is a country in ruins, not physically, not yet, but economically and spiritually. The Great Depression has gutted the middle class. Unemployment is staggering. 6 million Germans are out of work. The roads, what few exist outside the major cities, are mostly empty because cars are luxury items that ordinary people cannot afford. In a country of 66 million people, fewer than 1 million privately owned automobiles exist. The automobile, for most Germans, is as remote a dream as a villa in the countryside. Into this vacuum walks a man with a vision, or depending on how you look at it, a man with an obsession. Ferdinand Porsche was already 57 years old when he first sat down to sketch what would become the Volkswagen Beetle. He was a small, intense Austrian engineer with hands that seemed permanently stained with grease and a mind that operated like a fine mechanical instrument. Constantly calibrating, constantly revising, never satisfied. He had designed electric cars at the turn of the century. He had built race cars for Mercedes. He had founded his own engineering consultancy in Stuttgart. He was brilliant, difficult, and possessed by a singular idea: that the automobile should not be the property of the wealthy alone, that a well-engineered, reliable, affordable car could and should exist for ordinary working people. He had been pitching this idea to German manufacturers for years. They were not interested. Building cheap cars, they told him, was not profitable. The margins were too thin, the engineering challenges too great, the market too unpredictable. So Porsche's vision sat on the shelf, gathering dust. Then Adolf Hitler came to power. Now here is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable, and it is important to sit with that discomfort rather than smooth it over. Hitler, whatever else he was, had a personal obsession with automobiles. He had been fascinated by them since childhood, collected photographs of them, and believed deeply that a motorized nation was a strong and modern nation. His political project required, among other things, the transformation of Germany into a car-owning society. He wanted highways, the Autobahn, and he wanted cars to fill them. And he wanted those cars to be within reach of the ordinary German worker. In 1934, Hitler met Ferdinand Porsche. The two men, in another historical universe, might seem like an unlikely pair, but their obsessions aligned with dangerous precision. Hitler handed Porsche a commission: design a car that could carry 2 adults and 3 children, travel at 100 kilometers per hour on the new Autobahn, achieve at least 30 miles per gallon, and cost no more than 1,000 Reichsmarks, roughly equivalent to a working man's quarterly salary. It was, by any measure, an almost impossible engineering brief. Porsche looked at the numbers, looked at the specifications, and went to work. Now let me ask you something before we go any further. If someone told you they could build a car like that, fuel efficient, affordable, fast enough for a highway, big enough for a family, in the 1930s, would you have believed them? The answer for almost every automobile engineer of that era was no, and yet Porsche did it. The question is how. The engineering decisions Porsche made were, at the time, radical departures from conventional automotive thinking, and several of them were decisions that other engineers had tried and largely abandoned. The first and most significant was the engine's location. Every mainstream automobile of the 1930s had its engine in the front and its driven wheels at the back. This was the established formula. Logical, predictable, well understood. Porsche placed the Beetle's engine in the rear, not just behind the rear seats, but behind the rear axle, hanging out over the back wheels. This was unusual enough to raise eyebrows, but Porsche had clear reasons. With no engine up front, he eliminated the need for a long drive shaft running the length of the car, which saved weight and simplified the drivetrain. The rear engine sat directly over the driven wheels, improving traction on the slippery roads of the time, particularly in winter, and it opened up a front trunk, what Americans would later call a frunk, that could hold luggage without competing for space with mechanical components. The engine itself was a work of elegant minimalism. 4 cylinders arranged in 2 flat opposing pairs, what engineers call a boxer or flat 4 configuration, air-cooled by a fan rather than by a liquid water circuit. This last decision was particularly consequential. A water-cooled engine requires a radiator, coolant, hoses, a water pump, and all the infrastructure that surrounds them. A water-cooled engine in winter can freeze. A water-cooled engine can overheat if the coolant leaks. Porsche's air-cooled design eliminated all of that. There was no coolant to freeze in a German winter. There was no radiator to clog or crack. The cooling fan was mechanically simple and driven directly by the engine. In the harsh, practical terms of a vehicle intended for working-class ownership, this was a profound reliability advantage. The displacement was tiny, initially just 985 cubic centimeters, later growing to 1,131 cubic centimeters and eventually to 1,200 cubic centimeters in the post-war production versions. By comparison, American family cars of the same era were running engines of 3 or 4 liters. The Beetle's engine produced roughly 25 horsepower, but in a car that weighed less than 750 kilograms, 25 horsepower was enough. The bodywork was designed by Porsche's team, with some contested contributions from a Hungarian engineer named Béla Barényi, and it was shaped, consciously or not, like an insect. The rounded domed roofline was not merely aesthetic. It emerged from practical aerodynamic thinking. A smooth, rounded body generates less drag than a boxy one. The Beetle's drag coefficient was remarkably low for its era, which contributed directly to its fuel efficiency on the Autobahn. Nature had already solved the problem of moving efficiently through air, and the Beetle's shape borrowed from those solutions. The curve of a Beetle's carapace, the smooth dome of a river stone. The torsion bar suspension system Porsche designed was another innovation. Instead of conventional coil springs, each wheel was suspended by a set of short steel bars, twisted under load, torsion bars. This arrangement was more compact than coil springs and remarkably durable. It gave the Beetle a ride quality that surprised early testers, and importantly, it was simple enough to maintain in the field without specialized equipment. By 1936, 3 prototype Beetles, they were called VW3 at this stage, completed a grueling test of 50,000 kilometers. By 1938, 30 pre-production cars were undergoing further evaluation. And in that same year, the regime laid the cornerstone of an enormous new factory in a place that was at the time barely more than a field beside the Mittelland Canal in Lower Saxony. They called the new town that grew up around it Kraft durch Freude Stadt, strength through Joy City. The factory was designed to produce 1.5 million cars per year, which would have made it the largest automobile plant in the world. The propaganda surrounding the car's launch was enormous. The regime created a savings scheme. the KdF-Wagen savings book, in which workers could purchase 5 Reichsmark stamps each week, pasting them into a booklet until they had accumulated the full purchase price of their car. Hundreds of thousands of Germans enrolled. They handed over their wages week by week, trusting in a promise. The promise was never kept. By September 1939, Europe was at war. The factory, still barely operational, was converted to wartime production. The workers who had dutifully collected their stamps received nothing. Their savings were absorbed into the machinery of a collapsing regime. The people's car became a war machine. The Beetle's wartime incarnation was the Kübelwagen, a word that translates approximately as bucket car. It was a stripped-down, utilitarian version of the Beetle platform adapted for military use, with a higher ground clearance, simplified bodywork, and a reduction gear portal axle system that gave it remarkable off-road capability despite its modest power. The Wehrmacht deployed hundreds of thousands of them across every theater of the war, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen Eastern Front. A companion design, the Schwimmwagen, could actually float and cross rivers under its own power. Both vehicles confirmed what Porsche had designed into the platform from the beginning. A mechanically simple, extraordinarily robust machine that could function in conditions that would have destroyed more complex vehicles. The factory at what was now simply called Stadt des KdF-Wagens, soon to be renamed Wolfsburg, produced Kübelwagens and military components until 1945, when Allied bombing raids began systematically dismantling it. By the end of the war, the factory was a ruin. The town itself was barely standing, and Ferdinand Porsche was in a French prison, awaiting war crimes charges that would keep him incarcerated for 20 months before his ultimate release. The future of the Volkswagen, such as it was, now rested on no one's shoulders, because no one could agree who owned it, what to do with it, or whether it was worth saving at all. Here is the moment in the story where a single human decision changed everything. The Wolfsburg factory fell within the British zone of occupation. In 1945, British military authorities were responsible for administering this bombed-out shell of an industrial complex, and almost immediately the question arose, what should they do with it? The British invited their automobile manufacturers to examine the plant and evaluate whether it was worth taking as war reparations. The answers they received were remarkable in their collective blindness. A delegation from the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders visited the factory, examined the Beetle prototype, and concluded, in a report that has become legendary for its spectacular wrong-headedness, that the car was of no commercial value. The design, they wrote, did not meet the fundamental technical requirements of a motor car. It was too ugly, too noisy, too underpowered. No one would want it. Ford was also offered the plant and the design. Henry Ford II declined. The car, he reportedly said, was not worth a damn. In the chaos that followed the German defeat, there was a real possibility that the entire Volkswagen enterprise would simply be abandoned. The factory scrapped for materials, the design shelved, the thousands of workers left without prospects. This is where Major Ivan Hurst entered the story. Hurst was a 30-year-old British Army officer, a mechanical engineer by training, assigned to administer the bombed Wolfsburg plant as part of the occupation authority. He was not a grand automotive visionary. He was a practical man, given a practical problem. There were thousands of workers in Wolfsburg who needed employment. There was a factory that, with some effort, could be made operational, and there was a car design waiting to be built. The British Army needed vehicles. The logic to Hurst was simple. He patched the roof with cardboard. He removed unexploded bombs from the factory floor. He sourced spare parts from scattered military dumps and local suppliers. He got the assembly line running again. And in 1945, the bombed, battered factory at Wolfsburg produced 1,785 Volkswagen Beetles, painted in the only color Hearst had available in sufficient quantity: dark green. These cars went to British military and occupation authority personnel. They kept the factory alive. And as Hearst continued to push production through 1946 and 1947, the numbers grew: 10,000 cars in 1946, 20,000 in 1947. By 1948, 50,000. The Wolfsburg factory, which no automotive expert had been willing to take on, was beginning to look like something remarkable. And then arrived the man who would turn it into something extraordinary. Heinrich Nordhoff had run the Opel factory in Brandenburg before the war, and he understood mass automobile production in a way that few Germans did. He was recruited to lead Volkswagen in January 1948 by the British occupiers, who had decided that the company needed civilian professional management rather than military administration. Nordhoff was 50 years old, precise, imperious, and possessed of an industrial vision that was perfectly calibrated to the moment. His philosophy was counterintuitive for an automobile executive. Do not change the car. At a time when American manufacturers were annually redesigning their vehicles with new bodywork, new features, and orchestrated obsolescence, Nordhoff committed to producing essentially the same Beetle year after year, refining it mechanically and improving its quality without changing its fundamental character. He understood, perhaps more intuitively than he could have explained, that the Beetle's design was not a liability. It was an asset. It was memorable. It was consistent. In a world exhausted by upheaval and change, a car that stayed the same was a car you could trust. Under Nordhoff, the factory became a model of post-war German industrial recovery. Production numbers climbed steeply: 100,000 cars by 1950, 500,000 by 1953. The Beetle's quality, initially rough, as any wartime improvisation would be, was systematically improved. The engine grew. The suspension was refined. The interior became more comfortable. But the shape stayed, the sound stayed, the personality stayed. The Beetle began to find its way into export markets. In 1950, the Netherlands. In 1951, Belgium, Switzerland, Sweden. And then, against all expectations and against the conventional wisdom of nearly every automotive market analyst, it crossed the Atlantic. The story of the Beetle in America is one of the strangest and most instructive stories in marketing history, because the Beetle arrived in the United States at precisely the wrong moment in the worst possible configuration by every standard rule of American automotive culture, and proceeded to become a cultural phenomenon. It was 1949 when the first two Beetles were officially imported to the United States. They were shown to dealers who were uniformly unimpressed. The cars were small when America worshipped size. They were slow when American highways rewarded power. They were ugly, genuinely, objectively unusual looking, in a country where automobile styling was treated as high art. They had no trunk in the conventional location, no conventional heater, and an engine that observers described as sounding like an angry sewing machine. Sales in those early years were effectively zero, but something interesting was happening beneath the surface of American automotive culture. The 1950s were the decade of the tail fin and the chrome strip and the two-tone paint job. American cars grew larger and more theatrical with each passing year, and a small but growing segment of American consumers, educated, urban, self-consciously unconventional, began to find this excess not aspirational but absurd. They were looking for an alternative that expressed their values: practicality over pretension, honesty over spectacle, intelligence over indulgence. The Beetle, with its absolute refusal to pretend to be anything other than what it was, became that alternative. By the mid-1950s, a network of Volkswagen dealers had established itself in the United States. Sales were still modest but growing. And then, in 1959, came the advertising campaign that would cement the Beetle's place in American culture and, arguably, transform the practice of advertising itself. The agency Doyle Dane Bernbach, DDB, was given the Volkswagen account, and what they produced remains to this day a masterpiece of honest salesmanship. Rather than hiding the car's strangeness, they celebrated it. The most famous ad in the campaign featured a photograph of the Beetle, tiny, round, sitting alone in enormous white space, with the headline, "Think Small." In an era when every other car advertisement was trumpeting bigness, power, and glamour, here was an ad that told you the car was small and asked you to consider that this might be a virtue. Other ads in the campaign showed the Beetle floating on water above the headline, "Volkswagen's unique construction keeps dampness out," and cheerfully admitted that a production defect had caused their quality control team to reject a particular car. The honesty was radical. The humor was disarming. The effect was transformative. American sales doubled, then doubled again. In 1968, the year the United States was convulsed by assassinations and protests and the visible fracturing of its post-war consensus, the Beetle became the best-selling import car in American history. Young people, students, artists, musicians, activists, adopted it with a fervor that went far beyond brand preference. The Beetle became a symbol. You decorated it with flowers and peace signs. You drove it to rallies. You named it. The car that had been conceived in the most authoritarian context imaginable had become, 30 years later, the unofficial vehicle of the counterculture. Think about that irony for a moment. A car designed at the explicit demand of Adolf Hitler, built initially by forced labor intended to serve a fascist state. That car had become the chosen symbol of an entire generation defined by its opposition to conformity and authority. History is sometimes stranger than anything a novelist would dare to invent. Let us talk about what actually made the Beetle special to drive, because the engineering story and the cultural story are inseparable, and the cultural story cannot be fully understood without understanding why the car worked the way it did. The Beetle was not fast. Its 0 to 60 mph time in standard form was around 27 seconds. In the 1960s, you could be passed by a moderately ambitious horse. Its top speed was roughly 70 miles per hour, and achieving that speed required a long, flat road, a tailwind, and considerable optimism. On hills, particularly loaded with passengers, it wheezed. But the Beetle had a quality that its critics struggled to articulate, and its owners could not stop talking about. It was honest. It asked nothing of you beyond basic maintenance. It told you, through its sounds and its behavior, exactly what it was doing and why. The air-cooled engine behind your ears produced a distinctive clatter that varied with load and speed in ways you quickly learned to read. The torsion bar suspension communicated the road surface with unusual directness. The car weighed so little that you always felt physically connected to it in a way that larger, heavier, more insulated vehicles did not provide. Crucially, it was fixable. The mechanical simplicity that Porsche had built in as a cost-saving measure became, decades later, an empowerment for owners. There was no elaborate cooling system to fail. There were no self-adjusting hydraulic tappets to mystify. The engine could be removed and replaced in an afternoon with a floor jack and basic hand tools. The Haynes manual for the Beetle reads more like a short story than a technical document. Millions of people who had never considered themselves mechanically capable learned to maintain their own Beetles because the car made that learning accessible. It was, in this sense, a democratic machine, not just affordable to buy, but affordable to keep. And here is a question worth sitting with as we move into the darker chapter of this story. If a car is reliable, affordable, beloved, and culturally significant, what does it take to kill it? The answer, it turns out, is a combination of safety regulations, emissions standards, and the inexorable advance of engineering that the Beetle's fundamental design could not accommodate. And the story of that decline is its own kind of tragedy. By the late 1960s, the American market, which had been the Beetle's most profitable and culturally significant territory, was undergoing regulatory transformation. Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, published in 1965, had exposed the automotive industry's cavalier attitude toward occupant protection. New federal safety standards were being written into law, and they were particularly unkind to rear-engined cars. The Beetle's handling characteristics, that rear engine weight causing the back of the car to step out in emergency maneuvers, that early tendency toward oversteer that could catch inexperienced drivers by surprise, became targets of safety criticism. VW made continuous improvements, but the fundamental physics of that rear engine, rear drive layout created handling characteristics that required driver awareness that the new regulatory environment was increasingly unwilling to assume. Simultaneously, emissions standards were tightening. The simple, air-cooled flat-four engine that Porsche had designed for simplicity and reliability was not well suited to the catalytic converters and oxygen sensors that the Clean Air Act's requirements were demanding. Water-cooled engines could be more precisely controlled for fuel mixture. Air-cooled engines resisted this control. The Beetle's engine, for all its durability, was showing its age. And then there was the fundamental limitation that no amount of engineering refinement could overcome. The Beetle's design was fixed. That rounded body, conceived in the 1930s, had aerodynamics that made perfect sense for the speeds of its era, but which, at American highway speeds, generated more drag than modern designs were producing. The chassis, unchanged in its fundamental geometry for decades, could not easily accommodate the front-wheel drive layouts that were proving superior for compact car handling dynamics. The Beetle could be improved, but it could not be transformed without ceasing to be a Beetle. VW understood this. The company had been working on successor designs through the late 1960s and into the 1970s. The result, unveiled in 1974, was the Golf, the rabbit in American markets, a front-wheel drive, water-cooled, practical hatchback that was everything the Beetle was not in engineering terms, and which proved to be a brilliant car in its own right. The Golf was the rational answer to the question of what the Beetle's successor should be, but rational answers and emotional ones are not always the same thing. Volkswagen officially ended Beetle production in Germany in 1978. The emotional response was significant, but not crippling. The Golf was succeeding, the company was healthy, and the world was moving on. Production continued in Mexico, however, serving a market where the Beetle had become so deeply embedded in daily life that it was effectively irreplaceable. Mexican taxi drivers ran Beetles for decades after German production ended, servicing them in roadside workshops with parts sourced from an extensive and ingenious aftermarket. The Beetle in Mexico was not a nostalgia item. It was transportation, used, practical, essential. Mexican production finally ended in 2003. The last Beetle, old number 21,529,464 to be precise, rolled off the assembly line at the Puebla plant on July 30th, 2003, wearing a metallic blue color called Aquarius Blue. Factory workers wore black armbands. There was a small ceremony. The car was driven to a museum, and a production run that had lasted 65 years and produced more than 21 million units, the longest and highest volume single-model production run in automotive history, was over, or almost over. Volkswagen had not forgotten the emotional capital that the Beetle name represented. Through the 1980s and 1990s, as the Golf and Jetta and Passat built the modern VW brand into a global enterprise, the memory of the Beetle remained a presence, felt in the company's advertising, invoked in anniversary marketing, worn proudly by the devoted owners of original Bugs who kept them running through decades and weather, and the normal attrition of mechanical life. In 1994, at the Detroit Auto Show, Volkswagen showed a concept car called the Concept One. It was designed by J. Mays and Freeman Thomas, and it was unmistakably a Beetle. The rounded roofline, the arched fenders, the friendly face formed by the headlights and curving hood. But it was a Beetle built on a modern platform, with a water-cooled front engine, proper safety structures, airbags, and all the regulatory compliance that 21st century motoring required. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. People loved it. They wanted it. They lined up to see it at auto shows around the world. The new Beetle, as it came to be called, went into production in 1998. It was built in Puebla, the same Mexican plant that was still producing original Beetles. It sold in enormous numbers and brought a new generation into contact with the Beetle's particular magic. The flower vase mounted on the dashboard, the deliberately cheerful character, the sense of driving something that wore its personality openly rather than hiding it behind corporate anonymity. But critics noted something that was, in retrospect, entirely predictable. The new Beetle was not quite the same thing as the original. Where the original's rounded shape emerged from functional decisions, the aerodynamics, the packaging constraints, the desire to minimize material usage, the new Beetle's shape was chosen for nostalgia. The form had been preserved, but the meaning behind the form had changed. It was a costume, beautifully tailored, but still a costume. The original Beetle had looked the way it did because it was the most logical thing to be. The new Beetle looked the way it did because people missed the original. This is not a criticism, exactly. It is simply a distinction. And it is a distinction the market eventually acknowledged. The new Beetle sold well through the 2000s, was updated and redesigned in 2011 as the Beetle, dropping the new with a slightly lower, more masculine profile. But it never quite recaptured the emotional intensity of the original. By 2019, Volkswagen announced that the third-generation Beetle would end production. This time, the statement from VW's American CEO was direct. There are no plans to build another Beetle. The flower vase was finally empty. What remains then? What is the Beetle's legacy? Not the commercial history, not the production numbers, not the cultural footnotes, but the actual residue that this car has left in the world. The first and most concrete answer is that the Beetle is still out there, not in museums, or not only in museums, though there are extraordinary examples in preservation, concours-level restorations that have brought 50-year-old cars back to better than factory condition. The Beetle is still out there on the roads of every continent. In Brazil, where a different production history and a devoted ownership culture have kept thousands of Fuscas, the Brazilian name for the Beetle, from Fusca, a type of small insect, alive and operational. In California, where the sun preserves paint and the dry air forgives rust, and the culture has always embraced the eccentric and the vintage. In Germany itself, where original Beetles fetch prices at auction that would have astonished their first owners. In Mexico, where the legacy of the taxi fleets means that basic repair knowledge for the Beetle is still passed from father to son in small workshops on the outskirts of cities. The Beetle owner community is one of the most active, technically capable, and passionately committed enthusiast communities in the automotive world. There are clubs on every continent. There are internet forums where owners diagnose each other's problems with a specificity and generosity that rival any professional service department. There are suppliers who manufacture every mechanical component of every year of Beetle production. Not just the common wear items, but the obscure and the arcane, the specific trim pieces and the particular rubber gaskets. The car has been out of mainstream production for decades, but the infrastructure that keeps it alive shows no signs of collapsing. Why? Why does the Beetle generate this level of devotion when other cars of comparable age and rarity do not? Part of the answer is the accessibility we have already discussed. the mechanical simplicity that makes ownership possible without wealth. But that cannot be the whole answer, because simplicity alone does not generate passion. You do not name your Toyota Corolla. You do not hand-paint it with sunflowers and names from your children's first imaginations. You do not write poetry about it. The deeper answer lies in the Beetle's unusual combination of characteristics. It is simultaneously humble and distinctive. It does not try to be imposing, does not attempt to project power or status or wealth. It is visually uncomplicated in a way that invites decoration and personalization. Its rounded shape is inherently friendly. There is genuine psychological research suggesting that curved shapes trigger more positive emotional responses than angular ones, and the Beetle is almost entirely curves. It has a face, in the anthropomorphic sense. The circular headlights function as eyes in a way that generations of children have independently recognized. It makes you smile. This sounds trivial. It is not trivial. The emotional relationship between a person and their car is, for many owners, genuinely significant. And the Beetle seems to invite that relationship more readily than almost any other vehicle ever built. The engineering legacy of the Beetle is more complicated but equally real. Ferdinand Porsche's rear engine, air-cooled architecture did not become the dominant template for the automobile industry. The Golf and its front-wheel drive successors proved more suited to the demands of modern motoring. But several of the Beetle's specific innovations survived and influenced the broader engineering tradition. The torsion bar suspension that Porsche developed was later adopted by other manufacturers and remained in production vehicles through the late 20th century. The boxer engine layout that Porsche pioneered, those flat, horizontally opposed cylinders, was adopted by Porsche's own sports car company for the 911, where it remains to this day, making the Beetle and the 911 distant mechanical cousins in a family relationship that Ferdinand Porsche himself might have found satisfying. Subaru has used the boxer engine layout in its vehicles for more than half a century, reaching millions of drivers who have never thought about the Beetle but whose cars carry traces of Porsche's original thinking. The rear engine layout was further developed by Porsche for the 356 and then the 911, achieving performance levels that the Beetle itself never approached, but that demonstrated the fundamental validity of the layout when engineered to its potential. The Beetle proved that a rear-engine car could be reliable, could be manufactured to tight tolerances, could survive in conditions of real-world use. Without that proof, the 911 might never have existed, but perhaps the most enduring engineering legacy of the Beetle is philosophical rather than technical. The principle that Porsche insisted upon, simplicity, reliability, repairability, that a mechanical object should be honest about what it is and should be within the competence of an ordinary person to maintain. This is an idea that resurfaces whenever the automotive world over-engineers itself into inaccessibility. The repair culture that surrounds vintage Beetles is, in a small way, a living argument for that principle. These are cars that reward knowledge, that respond to attention, that give back to the people who take care of them. In an era of vehicles that communicate their faults through impenetrable error codes and require specialized diagnostic equipment to service, there is something almost radical about a car whose entire mechanical soul can be laid bare with a flathead screwdriver and a Chilton manual. There is one more thread to pull on before we close, and it is the most uncomfortable one. The Beetle was designed in the context of Nazi Germany, built initially at a factory that used forced labor, and launched as a propaganda instrument of one of history's most murderous regimes. Ferdinand Porsche himself was a member of the Nazi Party and an SS officer, not an innocent bystander swept up in events beyond his control, but an active participant in the regime's industrial machinery. The workers who assembled military vehicles at Wolfsburg included concentration camp prisoners and forced laborers from occupied countries. These are not peripheral footnotes to the Beetle's story. They are part of its origin. The post-war history of the Beetle, its redemption under British supervision, its transformation into a symbol of peace and individual freedom, its adoption by the very counterculture that most directly opposed everything that fascism represented, did not erase that origin. Nothing erases history. But it did demonstrate something important about the relationship between objects and meaning. Objects do not carry the values of their creators permanently and inevitably. A car designed to serve a fascist propaganda project can be rebuilt on different terms by different people with different intentions. The meaning of an object is not fixed at the moment of its creation. It is remade continuously by the people who use it and live with it and invest it with their own stories. The Beetles that drove to Woodstock in 1969 were not different machines from the Kubelwagens that crossed North Africa in 1942. They shared the same mechanical DNA, the same fundamental design language, but they meant completely different things, because the people using them meant completely different things. This is not a comfortable thought exactly, but it is a true one. And so, we arrive at the end of this long and strange road. 21,529,464 cars, 65 years of continuous production. A story that begins in the darkest corner of the 20th century and ends with a flower vase on a dashboard. A story that passes through wartime factories and post-war rubble, through one British Army officer's practical decision and one German executive's counterintuitive marketing philosophy, through the streets of San Francisco in 1967 and the workshops of Puebla in 2003. The Volkswagen Beetle was not the fastest car, or the most powerful, or the safest, or the most technologically sophisticated. It was, in many measurable ways, outclassed by its rivals and eventually by its own successors. But it had something that none of those rivals and successors ever quite replicated: an authentic personality, a face, a voice, a way of being in the world that made people feel something. That is not a small achievement. In a world full of machines that take you from place to place, it is actually a very rare one. The last one rolled off the line on a July morning in Puebla with a blue paint job and a number: 21,529,464. Someone drove it to a museum. Workers wore black armbands. But across the world, in garages and driveways and on country roads and city streets, millions of its brothers and sisters were still running, still clattering in their distinctive voices, still carrying their owners through their lives with that combination of honesty and warmth and stubborn mechanical reliability that Porsche, whatever else he was, designed into them from the very beginning. Some machines are tools, some machines are monuments, and some very rare machines become something stranger and more enduring: companions, characters in the stories of the people who own them. The Bug was one of those. It still is.